into it. And so the result was a DVD series that I bought from Amazon, and I've been watching it, and it's okay. But you also should know that Microsoft got behind a project that was done at UC Berkeley on big history, and it's an open source platform called maybe it's called Chronomesh, Chrono something or other, and it's at GitHub. And yeah,
that's a example of a platform for big history, you're saying?
Yes, and it was used in classrooms where teachers would actually get their kids to explore history and then put it in this timeline and then talk about it. And that was pretty much what I proposed in Tokyo.
That's wild. Steve, welcome. And we were just talking about this narrative, if you've heard of it, as big history.
I have not.
So the way I'm using it is that there's a risk in social innovation of a sort of amnesia of the past, in which by having this wonderful green field of a new discourse, there's a tabula rasa. And there's not a tabula rasa. There's this amazing global history that causes us to care about social innovation. And that social innovation history goes back to the history of the park and the history of the school and the history of any institution that achieved, end state transformation in the 19th century or 18th century, Steve, in that sense, where they got the transformation. Parks exist. They got the transformation. There's some literacy. But in other words, all of those social innovations, if people say, okay, we're not, in this stage where we can just start anew each context, we can actually say, what are all of the missing social innovations, not where that is from the future, but where we can tame the future with the past.
Bobby, this point was made in a somewhat different context by Steve Johnson in the book Where Good Ideas Come From. And he talks about mixing and matching from past innovations, sometimes things that failed because now that their time has come. So I think the notion of looking at some of the incomplete innovations of the past and what those who envisioned them wanted, we may see the seeds of something that we can do now.
I totally agree that there's bring all the social innovations that have ever existed that ought to be solving new problems to context. I agree with that. I think my context was to say that the futurists right now are a subculture that gather together, and the macro culture uses other language and narratives with which to interact with these ideas and ideals. And so, there's this frame of reference of what are all the untranslatable concepts that reflect the wisdom stack for the evolution of each individual in terms of their consciousness and each community in terms of their collective consciousness. And I think that there's a mix of those pieces. We've seen that there's, the Ikigai community is like a group of 50,000 people. The solar punk community is a group of 50,000 people. The futurist organizations, of which I've known 12 in the Bay Area, that's also sort of a group of the global followers of those organizations are sort of another group of 50,000 people. So I think the point is, what is the Rosetta Stone between social movements within which the different social movements related to different narratives of the future can each retrace the parts of their narrative that are buried. I mean, my point is not to say big history in the way it has been used. My point is big history as it would apply to cooperation, in the sense that, maybe every one of the 100,000 social innovations that Bob Spoer keeps track of, maybe each of them had a history before they existed, of the 100 years or 200 years of the 5 or 10 fields that they're bringing together new. And maybe all of those movements can recognize each other. So I think the point is, right now we have a context in which every social innovation discipline and community and subsector speaks its own language, right? Like, for example, the consequence internalization field, I learned that there was a whole nother field that overlaps with the contractual taxation field, that overlaps with the social impact bond field, which overlaps with the externality internalization field. And all of these fields don't talk to each other and don't have any overlap on the social context of community much. And so, in other words, what are all of these fields that actually need to be in cooperation? I'm going to frame one 30-second recap of a challenge that came up this week in conversation, and I think that then I'll turn over to a process of introduction, as we have a mix of folks, some of who have met each other and not all of whom have met each other. But the concept of, I spoke with someone who was talking about how their organization works with many thousands of other NGOs, and all of those have their own mission, their own narrative, their own purpose in isolation, and they don't cooperate as much as even the hedge fund industry cooperates, which I thought was striking. This person had left the hedge fund industry. Saskia and I were on the same conversation. He had left the hedge fund industry and had said that they cooperate much better than the social entrepreneurship sector, right? So, if we say, under what circumstances could the social entrepreneurship sector not just match cooperation levels of the hedge fund sector, because those people don't even share a purpose, but we should be able to exceed that threshold of cooperation and collaboration. So in order for that to happen, what are all the bridges that need to exist between our subsectors? And is there a way for those bridges to not be made of something fragile? There's these living bridges in Southeast Asia that are just marvelous in that they survive for hundreds of years because they're alive and that they've been woven together. I mean, are there living bridges in the social capital sense in which the social innovation movements that need to be in cahoots with each other could arrive in exponentially more collaboration than we've seen? Because I think that the collaboration gap needs to be addressed for systems change to reach the threshold of feasibility that our shared aspirations for it have. So with that, I'm going to pause and welcome colleagues. And one person who hasn't met our broader group here fully, Claudia, did you want to introduce yourself, and then we'll go around the circle? You're on mute.
Sorry, I clicked and did. Thanks, Bobby, for adding me to the group again. I promise I will be part of this group as many as my possible time frame can afford me. But my name is Claudia Akel, and I am a partner at Match for Action. That's how we all connected. But I live in Miami, and I run a company here named Social Impact Movement. It's a social enterprise focusing on developing local communities towards the Sustainable Development Goals. We're being more focused this year on connecting companies to the Sustainable Development Goals.
Thank you, Claudia. And Yangbo, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, so I've been doing this group periodically since the School Forum, the CrowdDoing hackathon then. Main focus these days is on impact finance, having spent about 15 years in various capacities around sustainability and sustainable development. So now it's bringing the means of information in, like bringing impact finance mainstream around green real assets and others.
Thank you, Yangbo. And Chuck, would you like to introduce yourself for folks who haven't met you?
Being great to be back in these calls again, and I've been really humbled by the intellectual power, particularly it's been seen recently on the LinkedIn chats, just seeing all these conversations going on. So really humbled to be part of this group. My day-to-day, I run a social impact consultancy called Orion Advising. I work primarily with startup stage social entrepreneurs, generally around coaching and preparing for funding readiness and counseling them in terms of how to capitalize their enterprises. And I also work as an organizer for social enterprise networks and for folks who are looking to reform and dismantle aspects of philanthropy at large. So good to see everyone.
Dismantle philanthropy. I hadn't heard that frame of reference, Chuck, before from you. Is that a new term that you're using? It's the first time I've heard the phrase from you.
I think that a lot of folks are just coming around to, who have been pushing on the reform side for a long time, who are starting to come to. So this system is fundamentally flawed in so many different ways, and that it is time, as per so many of these conversations we have, to reimagine it, to start to break it down and build it into something else.
I totally support reimagining and transforming as a premise. I think we don't want to just deconstruct philanthropy and not replace it with anything else, though. I think would be the other premise, perhaps, which
Absolutely.
is. But with that, speaking of transformation, Steve, would you like to introduce yourself for the folks who haven't met you?
I'm with the co-lead at the SDG Transformations Forum, which focuses upon acceleration of transformation. We're currently focused on an effort that's called Bounce Beyond, which is focuses upon the development of new next economies. So bringing together diverse people who are working around next economies to create focus and power amongst all of their efforts.
I think that's really important to have the infrastructure for the transformations we seek in society to be more feasible, and I think that mission is very resonant. Thank you, Steve. Bob, would you like to introduce yourself for folks who haven't met you?
Hi, everybody. Bob Spoer. I'm Chief Entrepreneur for People at Ashoka, founder of Collaboration for Talent. We're ending the war for talent and creating a more collaborative infrastructure for talent in the social sector, eliminating unconscious bias in networking, which is the sort of fundamental reason we have so much problem with our diversity, equity, inclusion, and hiring. And also a key advisor and initiator of an organization called Impact X, which actually is reimagining philanthropy, deconstructing or disrupting with a sort of a system of peer-driven change where investments go directly to the change makers as sort of autonomy respecting assistance that enables them to sort of both grow their own economies and impact as part of a larger impact measurement system.
And Bob, is the Impact X material live publicly now, or not?
Yeah.
Not at this point.
Yeah.
Okay. If you would like, yeah, I mean, I don't know if you want to take 5 minutes later on the call after introductions, but
sure.
If you'd like to share for 5 minutes, that I think folks would be interested in it. I know that it's been a good few months since we've had a chance to check in with that. I think it's an amazing intention and goal of the initiative, and so I'd welcome that. Mike, would you like to introduce yourself for folks who haven't met you? You're on mute. My apologies.
There we go. Yeah, I'm Mike Critelli. Although my career started pretty far afield from what we're talking about, I was 30 years at Pitney Bowes. In the middle of that career, I got involved in the process of creating a culture of health and well-being, first within the organization, and then to progressively broader groups of stakeholders. One of my post-Pitney Bowes careers was to build and deploy a patient-controlled, portable, lifelong, comprehensive health record. That did not succeed for a variety of reasons, but I now find myself involved with a successor initiative called the Commons Project, which is designed to create and deploy an integrated health record on smartphones. And what we've just been doing over the past week and a half is try to figure out how the health information and geographic data can give people rite of passage across either national borders or state borders. So we convened a global group of stakeholders to talk about how we could create the health, if you will, the commons pass, as we called it, so that people can reconnect with one another again.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Mike. And would like to invite Jack. Would you like to introduce yourself for folks who haven't met you?
Sure. I think fundamentally my work is in the space of using artificial intelligence and IT to tame global conversations. I'm very interested in this, the idea that the hyperpolarization that has crept in during my lifetime into our conversations is tameable, but it's not tameable when you just have hundreds or thousands of people in one room shouting. Robin Dunbar said that originally said that the largest stable social network you can have is 150 people, but he recently co-authored a paper that said no, it's actually 5. And so that tells you why guilds in World of Warcraft, for example, will have all of these role-playing features, and the roles simply take a guild of 50 people and break them up into 10 roles of 5, and you're now down in the Dunbar range. So we're going to have to do something like that to tame these conversations, and I'm very interested in the open source community's ability to begin to serve that space.
I think it's really interesting, and just to chime in that we spoke with NVU this week about the fact that they and us have a goal of, Leibniz, as the last person to teach all courses that were taught in his lifetime in Europe, knew those fields omnisciently in a way. 18 people before him likewise, but after that no one can. And so without 1,000 lifetimes, so without that, how do we get social innovation to have better odds of survival than World War I soldiers? And the answer is through cooperation at every interdisciplinary juncture that creates risk, so that we can achieve 10x or 1,000x better survivability of social innovation by getting the anticipation of preventing catastrophe that's possible through cooperation. And I think that's where your knowledge ecosystems are really important to the future thrivability of inchoate social innovations becoming successful in the world, Jack. So thank you. And Saskia, did you want to introduce yourself for any folks who haven't met you, or have you met everybody here?
I definitely have met everybody here at some point during
so do you want to
call.
comment on anything you've heard then, rather than introduce?
Yeah, I really liked your one of your first sentences today, Bobby, in regards to what is the Rosetta Stone between the different social movements to enable them to cooperate better. And I think that is one of our strategies, really, and one of the things that we have been trying to do. And when I say we, Bobby and I have been having loads of calls with different people that we think have something in common with what we are trying to do, and trying to talk to them to see if we are right, if we have understood what they've written, either on the websites or on a LinkedIn profile or wherever we've met them, to see if we have interpreted that correctly, and if they indeed would like to cooperate or collaborate in some way, somewhere on one of those intersections of potentially of risk or of opportunity that you just mentioned. So I think that is really interesting, and I think it's one of the things we are sort of trying to do here in these calls as well. So I'm always happy to listen to all of your inputs and trying to sort of pick out the things that we indeed can work together on.
I honor that goal. Karl, have you met everyone here, or did you want to offer commentary on what you've heard? Karl? I'm sorry, Karl, we can't hear you. We'll come back to you then. I'm sorry that it's inaudible. We'll come back. So I think that this brings up multiple threads, which I look forward to cross-referencing. I think that one way to weave these things together is that, there we go. Hi, Karl.
Hi. So my one comment would be, Jack, when Jack made comment about the polarization, it reminded me of a line I saw in a David Brooks column this morning. That in the Trump era, a lot of people who don't care about government got manic about politics. And you could probably put the start date of that into the cable TV, cable news era. I guess I'll say most of you know I'm in Oakland. I'm the author of a book called The Fair Share Model. And it's reimagining capitalism at the DNA level. And I guess what I want to do is to get more people who haven't cared about capital structures to start to do so, because there's a lot of creativity that could be applied to how to balance and align the interests of investors and employees.
So I think that this brings up, so I'm going to take a minute to try to weave together some of the dimensionalities that just got brought up, and then I'm going to see if Bob would like to share what we were mentioning. So I think one way to think about this is when you look at the comment by Yangbo that parks change life expectancy outcomes in the perspective that being near nature does that. You know, that's an example of where the prevention is through physical proximity. The narrative of social innovation agency is to be able to prevent risks to all kinds of stakeholders through social innovation product or service. The gap between the existing services of the world and products of the world and the social innovation version of the same is part of the transformation that Steve's advocated for, but not only at the social entrepreneurial level, but also at the legal level, at the contextual level, because sometimes when social innovation succeeds, it's able to get a shift in law. I appreciated the Bob, the Ashoka Systems Change podcast. They talk about the example of paraprofessionalization, adding a role of truckers preventing trafficking as an additional kind of transformation of transforming them as humans by adding a new role. I think that's another kind of transformation, is what are all the missing roles in systems change. I think that if we look at this from a economic justice point of view, per Karl, there's anticipatable injustices that are going to be created in the future that are preventable through some kinds of structuring. Now, if we connect this to a learning and dependency model, if we don't have a context of the big history of XYZ field, we might have that field out of context in a sense of disciplinary salience. One of the problems in the world has been when economists ran public policy that affected education, public health, and 1,000 other fields in the Washington consensus era. And that's arguably a question of the domination of some other fields through one discipline sort of becoming a field that affects all the others. What we want to figure out is a way for all of the fields to be organizable based on our values and goals. I met a social entrepreneur this morning who talked to me about in India an educational village in which they redesigned the entire youth education system so that every lesson was related to a different kind of basic human need, like a sustainable development goal. In other words, it would be every lesson was related to water or food or etc. And it would all be interdisciplinary based on the need, because the goal in that education was for the village to be self-sustainable with 100 graduates from such a program. And then they want to create 10,000 sustainable villages, regenerative villages, through that kind of model in that example. And I think that in that case, it's education as and learning architecture of these cooperation networks between these villages as a kind of knowledge garden, per Jack's frame of reference, to say they should all learn fast enough to be able to be in their theory self-sufficient. But I think in the context of global progression, I think there's a point, which is that you can see in Google Scholar some fields are just growing a hell of a lot faster than others. Some fields are progressing at the speed that is more utopian than others. And what we need is to figure out how to match the research pace to the aspiration gaps where there is a research gap, And where there's not, we just need to recycle better. We need to reuse the entirety of human history in a big history sense. And, you know, if the landscape ecology says that a landfill is 1 million drawers, each with another resource, you need the right moment at the right time for each resource. Well, so is history. It's been littered with tens of thousands of natural experiments of social innovators proving something is possible. And we need those at all the right moments in all the right places, all in cooperation to achieve all the shared intentions. So that's my attempt at weaving. But with that, I'm going to hand over to Bob.
Thanks, Bobby. Yeah, I think, I mean, there's a interesting discussion of how, you know, systemic change you're leading through CrowdDoing and through sort of the identification of social innovation gaps can be recognized as part of a sort of a system of, universal system of measurement. And that can be also potentially funded. You know, the individual organizations doing it can be, you know, supported and funded. The peer-driven change concept is sort of an alternative to, you know, escaping poverty on a system change, where the, you know, basic, sort of constituents identify sort of their own goals and lead their own, you know, change out of poverty. It's not the philanthropists that come in and sort of conduct, you know, interventions, right, that are directed at low-income families and individuals. And so it flips that model. And so the philanthropists can support the efforts, but they can't direct them. And these are businesses that are, you know, they might be a biodiversity farm or you know, solar energy startup. There might also be just a traditional business of, you know, construction, you know, or you know, food supply, but they all have pay it forward goals that they are transparent about, and then are open to receiving funds through the what we call mutuality platform, that are from community members or diaspora members or people just interested in peer-driven change, based on these goals that they're stating. And the NGO, you know, that is pulling this together can help, you know, keep them you know, sort of heading towards those goals, whether it's hiring local people, reducing carbon footprint, improving, you know, reducing, you know, food waste, whatever they are. And so in this way, you know, all small business can actually be, you know, sort of reimagined as impact businesses, because if they have this pledge and they actually follow through on it, and it could be measured in the context of, you know, sustainable development goals, as you said, then this is the unseen being seen, right? This is the hidden, you know, impact that we're not seeing, because it's, you know, we're just seeing the sort of philanthropic led stuff. And
I agree. One thread of that you brought up that I want to flag, and then I also want to include Raj, because I didn't mean to skip him in the introductions round earlier, but just to share that you reminded me, Bob, that in Philadelphia they took government contracts and said anyone could bid on any piece of them rather than have to bid on the whole of them. And they increased by several orders of magnitude the number of institutions that could bid on a piece of them. And I think between social movements, we need to do the same. We need to be able to say, you know, what are all the organizations that can adopt a piece of a collective challenge, and how can they do so by aligning what they're already identifying with as core mission to connect to it. Raj, did you want to comment and introduce? Raj? Okay, I can't hear Raj. Okay, we'll come back to Raj if you can hear. Okay, sorry.
Just a couple of very quick points. One is that the way we go forward is a technology we call hyper catalog, which links different types of impact, like you were saying earlier, that, okay, this is sort of all the same, and then there could be an aggregated ability to bring this, you sort of activity together in ways that we're not seeing currently, and that enables more cooperation, collaboration, and investment. So this is
so you're
a
saying,
brand new
Bob, so for
technology.
example, the regions that are represented on the call, like Claudia is working in the region of Florida, and Steve has a network of place-based transformation initiatives. So are you seeing this as a way for a region's impact gap to then get connected together to the world's pieces of relevance to that? Is that the way to think of what you're describing?
Right. That's also, yeah, comparative impact versus competitive impact, right? People can have ways in which they can, demonstrate what they're doing in their own language, with their own cultural context, and have it be, connected to a larger system that by which they then get, recognized for what they're doing.
Steve, have you been able to find shared nomenclature for the 100 kinds of transformation that have been mapped in the most elegant PowerPoints that I've seen you share in the Bounce Beyond universe?
No. Nomenclature varies a lot across the fields that you were pointing to. It's a very heterogeneous field of transformation. I'm interested in what Bob is talking about, because the question for me always is, how do you get together to decide, how do you define the collective challenge? How do you define the routes to addressing it? I've always bring up the only time I've seen this really interestingly collaboratively defined is around REAMP in the American Midwest, with their approach to bringing together for intense periods of time, an ongoing basis really now, but they began by bringing together funders and NGOs, and it was a funder that intervened to do this, to be able to understand how they were thinking about the sustainable energy challenge, and to identify, what they did was identify 6 key actions or areas that needed to be addressed. And then the funders agreed to align their funding strategies around those 6 key areas. So that addressed partly the nomenclature question. And the NGOs, of course, had agreed implicitly about applying for funding and taking action in those 6 areas. And they've created an ongoing community that revisits that on an ongoing basis. So it's really changed the dynamic between funders and those who are implementing into be a much more collaborative one.
Yangbo, have you ever seen a context in which a community's imagination has connected to the long-term structural addressing of their social innovation gaps at that level?
So it depends on really which levels looking at. If you take, for example, so back to this example of pieces, since how I can see is if you take the global goals at the city level, for example, let's say there are actually 3, and probably a few more, but I'd say there are 3 that you're going to single out for how they're addressing these issues. So one is Copenhagen, Denmark. They actually were the first city to explicitly bind themselves to a decarbonization target, which is the year 2025, and they announced this early this past decade. That's one. And then also city of Zurich, Switzerland, 2000 Watt Society that was developed over the course of the NOTS. Officially, they released it in the course of 2007 to 2010 timeframe. And it's really just rethinking about, all right, so how do we optimize things? It's really demonstrating that we can actually still have growth, prosperity, even without having increased material consumption. And what was quite interesting from their study, I'd like to point out, is they said it was actually in their model when resources are constrained, natural resources, material resources, where you actually had the highest quality of life. And at the same time, it's quite prescient, surprising them was quite prescient, given what we know now, that the path to unlimited technologization of the economy and society led to the doomsday scenario of a surveillance state.
Those are
so those
fascinating
two, plus,
examples. The two positive examples, I think, are really extremely resonant. And I think that the question of aspirational goal is warranted. I think the interesting thing is we have outcome-based budgeting, where the realists get together and say what's achievable. We have moonshot setting in the social entrepreneurship context, more from braggadocio or unrealistic optimism than from having a government to build the moonshot the way Kennedy had with the moonshot. So but in other words, aspirational goals that are achievable only with better social science and social innovation that any of us individually will have comprehensive mastery over should be achievable in every community. It shouldn't be reliant on solar punk cyber science fiction in order for us to talk about optimistic hyperrealism, near-term futurism. But Mike, you've been having a lot of conversations that cut across the realist and the optimist, and communities that we might want to say, how do we bridge them into this kind of narrative frame? And curious as to what you think of the conversation so far.
No, I like the idea of community-wide aspirational goals. I have touched two kinds of communities in the health area. One is a geographically confined community, and there have been a number of initiatives, some led by community leaders like in Benton Harbor, Michigan. Yale and the city of New Haven led an initiative called the Care Alliance in New Haven. And there even was an initiative in Las Vegas led by Caesar's World to create certain community-wide health metrics. So that's one, that's the geographic one. The other one, which I found interesting, which I stumbled on, was an initiative to bring down the number of deaths by alcohol in automobiles. That was actually led by a gentleman at the Harvard School of Public Health, Jay Whiteson, and it was everything from activating Mothers Against Drunken Driving, laws, public service campaigns. The most interesting piece of that was what he said was most effective. And he said, including a little bit of content in the TV show Cheers, which had the poster about the designated driver embedded into public consciousness, the idea that if you have alcohol, you shouldn't drive. And it was okay to have a designated driver. So those are the two kinds of initiatives I've seen. Almost
I would welcome the equivalent, Mike, if we could have all the systems change, community. I mean, we don't have $1 trillion to get all the movies to accept that as product placement, but as public service product placement from the future that is not dystopian, a non-dystopian future relevant product placement it's not even product placement, concept placement. It's getting in the cultural narrative of the present conceptual bridges so that the future that we need to navigate towards is not impeded by mimetic barriers that are preventable in that sense.
By the way, Whiteson did not have to pay a penny to get that content in. That was basically a conversation with the then president of the network, who ordered the writers to put in 10 seconds of designated driver content into every episode.
We
So
should figure
sometimes you
out the
can do that.
equivalents. We should get the equivalents in all these areas. Raj,
Absolutely.
maybe there's a regenerative equivalent. 10 seconds for the regeneration of the planet in every media content in the world that exists. You know, it's there. I mean, we probably need to figure out a way to make it accessible. Designated driving is maybe a simpler concept than, you know, discover that you can have a biodynamic meal. You know, I mean, but what do you think, Raj?
Well, I think the conversations are awesome as it is every week, and I really love the idea about knowledge gardens, and there we are. We are those little seeds and little flowers, and we have to make sure that, you know, they get their water and they get the sunlight and they get the care, so that some of these ideas that we are talking about, you know, can actually thrive. And that's all I can say at the moment.
We are the collective curators of an alternative future that is more defined by our aspirations than our deficits, and more feasible because we are in cahoots with each other and do not have to have lived each other's lives in order to make collaboratively feasible something that would be impossible without that. So I welcome that. So, I mean, one way to look at this is you are a steward of aspiration, Bob, not in the direct sense, but in the sense of, well, you also are in the direct sense, but in the sense of 100,000 social innovators in that ecosystem you've aggregated. Their aspirations are not being API connected to the aspirations of those city officials who are worried whether they're going to have a believable plan, or if they announce something, they better be able to guarantee it, right? But what we really need is the version of collective agency in which there's an aspiration proportionate to the wish, and then there's an API that connects to not what is the current best practice from 50 years ago or 30 years ago that's been super proven, and, you know, so much so that it's already, you know, you're talking about the laggards catching up at that point. But what are all of the tools that we have with which to make the aspirations that people actually have as a folksonomy, their wishes for society, feasible? And instead of having the bureaucrats say, okay, we're not going to be able to state any public goal that goes beyond our means to immediately guarantee we can achieve it, have all the goal gaps be an opportunity for the Rosetta Stone between social movements to constellate a bridge to the alternative future in which that transformation has become feasible. I mean, I think that's one narrative way to say it. Steve, is that a bridge to transformation for each community, and a bridge to the transformational context that they need for each social innovation, and in the sense that Bob's ecosystem is a stewarding these social innovation aspirations?
Well, I'm particularly interested in the just to connect. I like Bob's framing around the ecosystem. I always think in those terms too, and we're talking about bridges to the future economies. So what do they actually look like in terms of basic infrastructure? And I'd be happy to have some conversation one day in more depth about this. But we can see that the infrastructure is emerging in things like you're involved in, Bobby, the prevention derivatives. This embodies a logic that's different than the traditional logic. It's a collaborative logic, it's a values-based logic, it's a human needs-oriented logic. And so there's these examples of these bridges to this future economy that we're developing with a different logic that would be interesting to be able to actually talk about as bridges.
Bob, did we interpret what you're up to in a way that's consistent with what you're actually up to?
Yeah, you know, we're looking at organizing into communities of aim or place in a sort of networked improvement community context. We've talked about, you know, the whole Engelbart thing concept there, but the connecting piece is the system that these communities are addressing to change, right? So it's the system change, the type of system change that's going on, and to the extent that they're making progress towards changing the system of poverty, or changing the system of preventative risk derivatives, right? That there's that common ground of system change or system root that we're all aiming to correct for. That's what can unite us in collaboration. And then we have improvement science and a mechanism for API integration and communication that bridges all these things. If that makes sense.
Chuck, did you wish to comment on what you've heard today in this discussion?
Well, I spent some time there just exploring the Impact X site, so that's really interesting, Bob, just seeing what y'all have been working on. So looking forward to exploring that more. And yeah, I mean, there's so much to pick up on here. I'm really enjoying listening to folks, and to be perfectly honest. And but yeah, I mean, I don't know about like I said, when you were talking about big history, that really that kind of put the light bulb in my head and wondering well, what is our shared history? I think we're certainly going through a moment right now in the American context where I think it's the way we've told our history and the way we've institutionalized what the story of this country is it's really it's unraveling in so many ways as we realize that we do not agree at all on what our own shared history is. And so how do we actually and who's deciding what those learnings are, so that we can leverage those this amazing the human evolution in terms of thinking about the future. So that was kind of that I'm still thinking about that after you brought that up.
Well, and I think that part of that is there are figures in history, Ben Franklin and Thomas Swift, the author, who have major roles in the history of social innovation, social enterprise, and impact investing. And so I think there's a explanatory narrative to the broader world to say these fields that we've talked about as though they're new, they're actually things that relate to figures that you trust and have narrative from. Claudia, did you want to comment on any of the threads that you've heard in this discussion?
I'd like to comment on that last point.
Oh, go ahead, Rush.
If I may. I really like what Chuck just said, and I don't think history is something linear, and that all this destruction about this current past, what is going on in America, that is going to have an impact. I think that knowledge is a cloud, and we're building a new narrative based on new data points that we see. And history was not that, it did not come out of the printer's office with a printer stamp to say that's the truth. It's biased on its own. The winners always wrote the history. So here we are today, post that history. We've glorified some of that history, and now we're unglorifying some of that history, and somehow it doesn't matter, because truth and knowledge are just data points. So we're looking at past data points, and we're looking at present data points, and we're looking at new data points. New data points that we've seen, and new data points that we have to take into account. And that goes to the sense of what Bob Spoer's been working on with Impact X, is trying to bring in more data points so that we can perceive our current world with, with a more enriched perspective. And I think that's how we have to look at it, because
I think what you're saying, Raj, we need to data enrich the present with awareness of the future in order to not be cursed to repeat the problems and mistakes of the past.
Yeah, that's well said. Yeah.
And where the aspiration came from.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
In the property industry, Zillow has wiped out all information related to what the seller wanted to sell their place at. The only information you have is what the place sold at. And so there's a new company really that's actually doing this more accurate price predictor model with AI, saying, okay, this is what they wanted to sell it at, this is what it sold at this time with this complexity and this sort of thing happening. And that enables people to actually know much better as to what the value of something is. than if you completely wipe out any past history of what the seller wanted to sell it at.
And I think this is new ways of remembering as a way to create different differential agency. Claudia, did you want to comment on any part of the discussion that connects for you?
Yes, I have one comment. I would like to comment on one specific thing on regards of knowledge as a cloud and what we are doing right now as individuals, as people working on the social change system to innovate and create this change that we are all discussing. Recently, I realized that one of the reasons that businesses are not understanding specifically the Sustainable Development Goals, which I work every day with, is probably because there's a lack of visibility on several areas. And one thing that I decided to do is, what can I do to bring visibility to sectors that are kind of hidden from the massive public? So what I did during this pandemic with a programmer, a friend, we created a platform for hubbing all the information that circulates on the internet and select one major industry. So the goal is to get the biggest ones from industries. And we started with the banks. And it's coming out amazingly because we can filter the information that comes through all sorts of medias and allocate with specific algorithm that we created, allocated within the SDGs. So you're able to create reports and present to the same UN and for the banks that their visibility maybe are not the same mirror of their investments through the public. So I can explain that later more, but my point is, I think whatever we can do to get our ideas more tangible in the terms of visibility, it's better for everyone in the world. That's
I think reflecting our collective aspirations should not happen at one art exhibit out of every 500 art exhibits. It should happen endemically in order for our culture to not be tense warped into a past and retrospective default tense. There was an interesting thread. John Smart created an initiative around getting every student in the world who wants to study the future as much as they study history to have parity, tense parity between the study of futurism and the study of history. And I think that that's an interesting leverage point. I want to connect, I see both Steve and Yangbo added comments. I want to see if, Steve, you wanted to explain the new sphere.
Oh, well, it was just Thiel de Chardin's concept of what we're doing is actually evolving the world and our human consciousness. And that it's not just about the little things that we're working on, but there is actually a collective shift that is often invisible to us. So it can make our individual efforts seem unimportant, but it's about the contribution to the shift of a sense of reality and what actually is guiding our development in the world that is about the new sphere.
Saskia, did you want to comment on this, or should I go to Yangbo?
Yangbo just dropped off, did he?
Oh, got it. He just dropped off. Sorry, he'd comment just before. My apologies. I was going to say that reminds me of autopoiesis and social innovation as the expression of self-authorship of society. And if we think about it that way, then it's really a question of where are there people who understand that they have a narrative moment of opportunity for the continuation of that narrative into a space of feasibility. Because right now, I think the world is littered with narratives that are like halfway through books that people got to in their lives, and then the narrative stopped at this point because they weren't able to bring to fruition that intention or this other intention. And, you know, one of the most interesting conversations I keep having online is someone who created an initiative 10 years ago on a theme that's totally relevant today, but it didn't work then because it was too early.
Right.
But all of the people who were too early for all the ideals of shared purpose and premise are actually coalitions of shared premise. And I think what we need to get away from is, you know, I've always believed that it's important that you do create social innovations, and sometimes you do author them, but you don't have a domination of the authorial process that prevents cooperation sufficient to the purpose of actually having it happen in the real world. And the way to prevent that is to say that, you know, collectively there's many more social innovations than we can get done in any lifetime in isolation. I think 7 years ago, I thought I'd come up with more than 100 social innovations and realized that I was not going to get enough extra lifetimes to do so all in isolation on my own, and I needed to cooperate more deeply. And I think that in general, there's millions of people with an excess of aspirations and a shortage of hyper-realistic perspective of exponential feasibility of the achievement of those intentions. And those intentions are overlapping. And there are millions of Venn diagrams of shared intention, both for individuals and the institutions that they have leadership roles in. And so the systems change stack of intrapreneurs, social innovator, purpose-driven agent of shared contextualities is something that we need a narrative duct tape to bring those institutions. Sorry, Steve, go ahead.
Oh, well, I agree with you. I'm just thinking when I led something called the Global Finance Initiative in 2008, 2009, and when I talked with people about alternative finance approaches or new economic approaches, the conversation very quickly turned to very stultified 19th century ideas of communism, socialism, and capitalism. There was no way to get into a meaningful debate about or discussion about these things. And it's one of the things that's excited me now about which is behind Bounce Beyond, is that we now have a whole new array of framings about our economic future around regeneration, around circular economies, around the donut economies, around bin vivir economies. And so, but it is this overlapping set of Venn diagrams as you're talking about, and it creates a degree of, so we're at, in my mind, when you look at the innovation adoption curve, we're at the innovator and early adopter phase, which is dominated by people who are very understandably driven by their passion. And they're very individualistic and they're very charismatic. But to get to the early majority stage, we need to create the bridges to the early majority, which are things that people can just use. So for today, I was, without having to go through, oh, that's regeneration and understanding, it's like just being able to drive the car rather than go into the motor and the mechanics of the car. And today I was in a very exciting conversation with some people who are developing a new currency called Seeds. And it's exciting because it's creating a dynamic in its very development to reinforce the value system that's behind it. It'll be a wonderful thing to share with your with this afternoon, Friday after. I think of it as Friday afternoon. That's my time. Group.
I welcome that, and we're getting close to the edge of time, so we can do a last round the room of last commentary on this thread. But what I would say is, to the degree to which, without magical thinking, we have narrative duct tape, and that is allowing us to stitch together people, movements, social innovation theses, ideas, and narrative frames of reference, then I just think that we need to apply that sticky interconnectedness of narrative sufficiently for narrative feasibility in the real world. And I believe that that's feasible in cahoots with y'all. So let's just do a last round of last commentary before we adjourn for today. And I want to see Karl, last words from your side.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this. Like Chuck said, there's lots of ideas to think about. I appreciated Raj's exposition earlier. It was quite eloquent. Steve gave me a new word, noospheres. Bobby, you talked about the early adopters, the pioneers, which I sort of felt very warm and toasty about. But I'll leave you with two visual thoughts. One is kind of picking up on Steve's comment about resistance that people have to thinking about ideas differently. It was reminding me of a movie I saw in the 70s called Midnight Express, that some of the older ones may have seen. And there's a particular scene where an American has been put into a Turkish prison because he was smuggling hashish. The exercise room was sort of below the ground and it was a circular area. And for beginning few scenes, he's always down there walking in the same counter circular direction that everybody else is. But at one point he decides he's going to get out of there somehow. And he's sort of transformed in his head. There's nothing that's physically different. It's just that he's got a notion in his head. And it's sort of expressed when he gets in the exercise area. He goes the opposite direction from everybody else. And they're all going, no, 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 you can't do that. And that going upstream when everyone's going downstream, it was a very evocative idea. The other one was my favorite public broadcasting system, PBS ad, was from years ago. And it had some guy who's a school, or somebody who's watching television. He's this little blue dot that goes from the TV to above his head. And the next scene is that he's on his bus in the morning talking to other people on the bus about what he saw. And you can see that because there's the blue flashes, these blue dots going from his head to other people. And they follow a couple of other people going to their workplaces. But the final shot was one of these people is a school teacher. And he's talking to his classroom of young people. And there's little blue dots going to each of the kids that are seated there. The final shot is like a drone shot. You can see all the kids running out of the school down the stairs, and all of them have little blue dots. So this product placement we talked about earlier, the power of ideas, the dealing with being too early at times, but still when lots of people are too early, there's still something going on. And I think we're coming to a point where we can say there's going to be some ripening.
I look forward to the ripening of feasibility of every social innovation that allows collective aspirations to be increasingly feasible. We're going to have to adjourn momentarily. I just want to give the last round of folks. So, Bob, last words before we adjourn.
Yeah, I love the duct tape to narrative and aspiration, and sort of almost like shared theory of change. Just really quickly, you think about climate action, sustainable goal number 13, and then you look at corporates, and you can compare, okay, there's a number of corporates trying to do something about this, but you got Patagonia out there literally changing the entire business model of their company towards making that their business model, climate action, and then stopping producing clothes because there's no reason to produce new clothes. There's plenty of clothes out there that could be renewed, right? So taking that as a way to sort of say, okay, this is actually producing more of the climate action that we need because they're all going in that direction would be a really, I think, helpful way to bring this about.
Excellent. Last words from you, Raj? You're on mute, Raj. Sorry, you're on mute.
I wish we had a bit more time to dive into those wonderful ideas. As usual, I think we need to slow down. We're running on the surface all the time. We need to slow down because Karl has mentioned some wonderful ideas that we have to put our fingers on and mold them. And same thing with Bob, and same thing with Mike and Saskia. And even Chuck brought the ideas about dismantling philanthropy and potentially the future of philanthropy. I think we need to slow down, and we can't do this hyperspeed 1 hour, run across all the points and say, okay, we've managed to, touch something. I think we need to give it a bit more depth. So we need to slow down our breaths. Either, we decide to do our Friday afternoons, for 2 hours and give a bit more time for some of these ideas to emerge and allow those who have these ideas to let them put it onto the table. Let us discuss this and let it unfold.
Well, I support that we can always modify container. There's nothing permanent in structure that can't be adjusted. What I would share is that I would really enjoy if we had a full Habermasian ideal speech situation with you all, which would involve an infinite length of time and an infinite number of metaphors with which to discover collective agency. And an approximation asymptotically of that aspiration is what we all try to approximate as best we can. But without that, we can try to modify the container in ways that are feasible, Raj, and open to reimagining and creating alternative structures. Last words from Mike and Saskia. Mike, do you have last words before we adjourn? You're on mute, sorry. My apologies, you're on mute.
I wrote a note on the chat box. 2 things to be this duct tape. One is to figure out what the enabler is for moving from the early adopter to the early majority. And the second is the term that's been used in, I think, really more in the computer world, killer application. I mentioned deliberately the reason for the integrated health record, which got a lot of push because people now want a quick way of knowing who is coming into their country or their state that's healthy or that may not be healthy. Now, that we may not like the idea of people having to surrender their health information to someone, although there's a way to mask the actual health data. But what we are accelerating is the idea of an integrated health record on a mobile phone that could be universally available to everyone and that helps them really self-manage their health and well-being. So the question is, what's going to be the killer application for that or for any other systemic change? So that'd be one of my thoughts here, the enabler and, for lack of a better term, killer app.
Maybe the healing application, perhaps, rather than killer application.
Yeah. Well, what I mean by that is it's something that people feel they have to have for something that they are doing and needing every single day.
Mm-hmm.
That's my I used the wrong term, but the idea is something that people all wake up relatively simultaneously and say, I have to have this.
Don't leave home without it.
Yeah.
I support that. Last words from Saskia before we adjourn.
I very much like that idea, and that sort of comes back to the point that stood out for me was the same point from Mike in regards to the designated driver. That's pretty much it. Like if we could only come up with that thing that indeed pops into everybody's mind and it reminds them of the regenerative future in everything that they do, in every decision that they make, that would be fantastic. So it has been mulling over my head. Maybe we should invite some creative people to help us with coming up with something like that. It would be really awesome.
I support the reimagination of all containers needed to connect the narratives together for exponentially greater feasibility of all of y'all's aspirations individually and collectively. And with that, I'm going to formally adjourn us and wish y'all a phenomenal weekend.
Awesome.
Okay.
Thanks,
you.
everybody.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.